Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very simple.
Me.
And about 300,000 years of people looking around at perfectly decent land and thinking, we could walk that way instead. So dim the lights. Get comfortable. Let your brain slowly power down like an old medieval castle after a mildly disappointing feast. Tonight we're talking about the history of human migration. Which sounds energetic. Sounds like maps and arrows and conquering and bold exploration. But really, it's mostly about hungry people walking, very slowly, and occasionally arguing with their cousins. Now, before we get to kings marrying their relatives and entire dynasties collapsing because someone insisted on keeping the jawline in the family, we have to start earlier, much earlier, before crowns, before castles. Before anyone thought, yes, I shall rule by divine right and questionable genetics. We begin in Africa. Around 300,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia, because time was more of a suggestion back then. Anatomically modern humans show up. Homo sapiens, which modestly means wise human. Of course we called ourselves that. If Neanderthals had one, we might all be Homo, slightly confused but trying. For a very long time, humans stayed mostly in Africa. Which makes sense. It's where we evolved. The climate shifted. Grasslands expanded. Forests contracted. People adapted. They walked. They followed herds. They avoided being eaten. Very relatable goals. But around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago something happened. Groups of humans began leaving Africa. Not in a grand, organized parade. No speeches. No inspirational music swelling in the background. Just small bands. Families. Maybe 20 to 50 people at a time. Looking at the horizon and thinking, let's see what's over there. They likely crossed through what is now the Sinai Peninsula or the Bab el-Mandeb Strait when sea levels were lower. Which sounds dramatic. But really, sea levels rise and fall over tens of thousands of years. Entire coastlines shift. Land bridges appear. And humans, being curious and slightly restless creatures, wander across them. And wander they did. Into the Middle East. Into South Asia. Down along coastal routes. They moved slowly. Few miles per generation. Not per day. Per generation. Imagine your great-great-great-great-grandchild living 10 miles away and thinking, yes, we have traveled far. It was less of a sprint and more of a very committed family stroll. As these groups spread out, they encountered other humans. Not metaphorically. Literally. Neanderthals were already living in Europe and parts of Western Asia. Strong. Adapted to colder climates. And for a long time, we imagined them as brutish cave dwellers grunting at the moon. Turns out, they were human enough to interbreed with. 'Cause of course we did. Modern non-African populations still carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. Which means somewhere, tens of thousands of years ago, two individuals looked at each other across a Paleolithic campfire and thought, sure, romance finds a way. Neanderthals eventually disappeared around 40,000 years ago. There are theories. Climate change. Competition. Absorption into Homo sapiens populations. Extinction, but make it gradual and complicated. Meanwhile, humans kept moving. Into Europe. Cross Asia. Eventually into Australia around 65,000 years ago, which required some kind of early seafaring. Not luxury cruises. More like logs tied together and optimism. Then, much later, into the Americas. This part is particularly calm and fascinating. During the last ice age, sea levels were much lower. A land bridge connected Siberia to Alaska. It's called Beringia. For thousands of years, it existed as a cold, windy stretch of land. And at some point around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, humans crossed it. Again, no grand announcement. Just people following herds, following food, following possibility. From Alaska they moved south. Slowly. Generation by generation. Eventually populating North and South America. Reaching the tip of Patagonia. Which is astonishing when you think about it. But they didn't think about it that way. They were just living. Migration in this era wasn't a bold strategic move. It was survival. Climate shifts forced movement. Ice sheets advanced and retreated. Droughts expanded. Resources shifted. Humans adapted by doing what humans do best. Walking away from problems. And sometimes walking into new ones. Now here's the gentle irony. For most of human history, movement was normal. Staying in one place permanently. That's the strange innovation. It's only around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago that agriculture begins to appear in multiple regions. The Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica. And suddenly humans think, what if we didn't move? A radical concept. Instead of following food, they grow it. Which sounds efficient. And it is. Eventually. But early farming was backbreaking. Crops failed. Diets narrowed. Disease spread more easily in settled communities. It was not an obvious upgrade. Yet it allowed populations to grow. Settlements became villages. Villages became cities. Cities needed rulers. And rulers, as we'll see later, were often deeply unprepared for the responsibility. But we'll float to them soon. For now, imagine the slow expansion of humanity across continents. No borders. No passports. No awkward airport security lines. The sky. Land. Time. Over thousands of years, isolated populations began to diverge slightly. Skin tones adapted to varying sunlight. Body shapes adjusted to climates. Cultural practices developed independently. Languages formed. Then split again. Entire families of language, Indo-European, Sino-Tibetan, Afroasiatic, slowly branching like very patient trees. And none of it happened quickly. That's the part we forget. We compress migration into arrows on maps. Clean lines sweeping dramatically from one continent to another. In reality it was slow, quiet, generational. A child born in one valley might grow up, have children, and those children might settle a few miles further. And their grandchildren a few miles further still. And over centuries, entire continents filled. Now, let's gently shift toward something slightly more organized. Around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, with agriculture established, some populations begin moving again, but differently. Pastoralist groups from the Eurasian steppe, for example. These were mobile herders, skilled with horses, used to wide open grasslands. And around 3000 BCE, they began expanding outward. These migrations likely contributed to the spread of Indo-European languages across Europe and parts of Asia. Which means that somewhere on a windy steppe, a group of people speaking an early proto-language looked at the horizon and said something that would eventually become Latin, Sanskrit, English, and dozens of others. Casual influence. No big deal. Migration now wasn't just survival. It was expansion. Sometimes peaceful, sometimes not, but always gradual. And as populations met, they mixed. They traded. They argued. They borrowed words. They adopted technologies. Humans have always been a blend. Pure isolation is rare. Movement is constant. And that brings us to a subtle but important point. The idea that people belong permanently to one fixed piece of land is historically very new. For most of human existence, land was something you used, moved across, adapted to. Ownership, borders, national identity, those come much later. But don't worry. We will absolutely get to the kings who insisted land was theirs because their great-uncle once sneezed on it. For now, just let yourself drift through the deep past. Picture small fires flickering under open skies. Footsteps across grasslands. Children learning the shape of new rivers. No grand speeches. No dramatic orchestras. Just movement. Because staying still, historically speaking, is the unusual choice. And humans, as we'll see again and again, are not very good at staying still. In the next part, we'll slowly glide into the age of empires, when migration becomes conquest, trade becomes empire building, and rulers begin rearranging entire populations like pieces on a slightly dysfunctional chessboard. And of course, they will insist it's destiny. But for now, just breathe. We've only walked about 70,000 years. Plenty more miles to go. Part 2. When empires started rearranging everyone. Alright, let's gently pick up where we left off. Humanity has spread itself across the planet. Very slowly, very patiently. We've walked through deserts, crossed land bridges, stared at oceans and said, well, that's inconvenient, and eventually figured out how to cross those two. Now we enter a different phase of migration. Because once humans settled down, built cities, and invented rulers, movement didn't stop, just became more organized, and occasionally more forced, which is, as it turns out, a very human development. Let's float into the ancient world. By around 3000 BCE, large civilizations are thriving. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley. Later, China's early dynasties. These are places with walls, bureaucracy, axes, kings who are absolutely convinced the gods personally approved their leadership. And with agriculture supporting large populations, cities grew dense. Dense populations mean labor. Labor means projects. Projects mean rulers deciding that thousands of people should relocate for the greater good, which usually meant building something very large. Take ancient Mesopotamia. Cities like Ur and Babylon were magnets for migration, not because they were glamorous, but because cities offer opportunity, trade, protection, food storage, and taxes. Always taxes. People moved voluntarily to urban centers for work and trade. But they were also moved involuntarily through conquest. Empires expand. Empires conquer. And when they conquer, they don't just take land. They take people. The Assyrians were particularly fond of this strategy. Around the first millennium BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire became very efficient at relocating entire populations. Conquer a city. Deport thousands. Scatter them across the empire. It served two purposes. 1. Prevent rebellion. It's harder to revolt when your neighbors don't speak your language. 2. Redistribute skilled labor. Efficient, practical, mildly devastating. And so migration becomes policy. Not wandering. Not curiosity. Administration. The Babylonians did it too. The famous Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE saw segments of the Jewish population relocated to Babylon after the conquest of Jerusalem. Entire communities uprooted. Again, not because they felt like exploring, but because someone else decided. And this pattern repeats. Let's gently drift westward to the Mediterranean. The Greeks were enthusiastic colonizers. From around 800 BCE onward, Greek city-states established colonies across the Mediterranean and Black Sea, southern Italy, Sicily, the coast of modern-day Turkey, parts of North Africa. Sometimes this was due to overpopulation, sometimes political conflict, sometimes simply economic ambition. And occasionally because two rival elites in a city had a disagreement and one group thought, you know what? Let's just start a new city, which is dramatic, but also very human. These colonies weren't random camps. They were full cities, with temples, agoras, very strong opinions about olive oil. Migration here spreads culture, language, architecture, religion, trade networks. Then comes Rome. Rome. If you want to see migration turned into infrastructure, Rome is your empire. The Roman Republic, and later the Empire, expanded across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. With conquest came roads. And with roads came movement. Soldiers moved. Merchants moved. Administrators moved. Slaves were moved in vast numbers. Rome was a melting pot long before that phrase existed. At its height, the city of Rome itself may have had over 1 million people, drawn from across the empire. Gauls, Syrians, Egyptians, Berians, North Africans. If you walked through Rome in 100 CE, you would hear dozens of languages. And the empire encouraged movement. Veteran soldiers were settled in colonies across conquered lands. Trade networks connected distant provinces. Grain from Egypt fed Rome. Silver from Spain funded projects. And enslaved people, captured in wars, were transported across the Mediterranean in staggering numbers. Migration here was economic, military, and forced all at once. But Rome wasn't unique. In Asia, similar patterns unfolded. The Han dynasty in China expanded westward, encouraging settlement in frontier regions, moving populations to stabilize borders, opening trade routes that would later be known as the Silk Road. The Silk Road wasn't a single road, by the way. It was a network, spanning thousands of miles, linking China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. And along these routes people moved. Merchants, nomads, monks, soldiers. Ideas moved too. Buddhism traveled from India into China, slowly, quietly, carried by traders and missionaries. Diseases moved as well, because migration has always had side effects. Now let's drift into a slightly windier landscape. The Eurasian steppe. Wide grasslands stretching from Eastern Europe to Mongolia. This region produced wave after wave of nomadic migrations. The Scythians, the Huns, the Turkic peoples, the Mongols. Mobile societies built around horses, herding, and flexible political structures. And every so often, these steppe groups would move outward in large numbers, sometimes due to climate shifts, sometimes pressure from other groups, sometimes ambition. The Huns in the 4th and 5th centuries CE are often associated with triggering the migration period in Europe, which sounds tidy. It wasn't tidy. Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, moved into Roman territory, some fleeing the Huns, some seeking land, some invited as federated allies. The Western Roman Empire, already strained, gradually collapsed under this pressure, and so entire populations shifted across Europe. Not overnight, not in one dramatic invasion, but gradually. The Goths settled in Spain and Italy. The Vandals crossed into North Africa. The Angles and Saxons moved into Britain. And Europe began to reshape itself. Again. Because migration is rarely a one-time event. It's layered. Continuous. Now let's gently float further east. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire expanded at a pace that must have felt dizzying. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, Mongol armies swept across Central Asia, China, the Middle East, and parts of Europe. This expansion caused enormous population displacement. Cities were destroyed. People fled. Others were forcibly relocated. But the Mongol Empire also connected Eurasia in unprecedented ways. Trade flourished across the Silk Road under Mongol protection. Artisans and scholars were relocated across vast distances. Technologies and ideas spread rapidly. Gunpowder, printing techniques, medical knowledge, migration once again reshaping the world. Now here's the gentle pattern emerging. And with trade came migration. Arab merchants settled along the East African coast, blending with local populations, creating Swahili culture, a fusion of African and Arab influences. In Southeast Asia, Indian cultural and religious ideas spread through trade and migration, influencing local kingdoms. All of this happened gradually. No loud announcements, just ships, winds, markets. Now, as we approach the late medieval period, something begins to change. Technology. Shipbuilding improves. Navigation tools develop. Knowledge accumulates. And soon migration will expand across oceans in ways that permanently reshape the planet. But before we leap into that era of global empires and mass displacement, let's pause. Up to this point, migration has been regional, continental, connected across landmasses. The Americas remain largely separate. Australia relatively isolated. Pacific islands settled through remarkable seafaring, but not yet fully interconnected with Eurasia and Africa. The world is big, and movement is significant, but it's not yet fully global. That's about to change. In the next part, we'll drift into the age of oceanic exploration, when European powers begin crossing the Atlantic, when entire continents are pulled into a single global network, and when migration becomes, well, industrial in scale, which, as you might expect, comes with consequences. Some ambitious, some tragic, all very human. For now, just imagine the quiet before that storm. Caravans crossing deserts, horsemen on open plains, merchants sailing with the monsoon winds. The world connected but still gently spaced. It won't stay that way for long. Part 3. When the oceans stopped being polite boundaries. Alright. We've wandered through grasslands, stood in ancient cities, watched empires gently rearrange entire populations like furniture they didn't fully know how to assemble. Now we approach the water. Because for most of human history, oceans were less like highways and more like suggestions to turn around. They were large, moody, and deeply uninterested in your travel plans. But humans, as we've established, are not very good at accepting limits. So sometime in the 1400s, a few European kingdoms looked out at the Atlantic Ocean and thought, we could probably cross that. And of course they did. Let's begin with Portugal. Small country, big maritime ambition. Prince Henry the Navigator, who did not personally navigate very much, sponsored voyages down the west coast of Africa. Slowly, carefully, hugging the coastline. This wasn't heroic adventure. It was incremental mapping, trading posts, wind patterns, currents, learning by doing. And learning sometimes meant not coming back. But gradually, European sailors gained confidence. Caravels improved. Navigation tools like the astrolabe became common. Knowledge accumulated. Then, in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west. He was not trying to discover a new continent. He was trying to reach Asia by sailing across the Atlantic. Because he underestimated the size of the Earth, which is bold and mildly concerning. Instead, he reached the Caribbean. And with that voyage, something enormous began. The Columbian Exchange. Sounds almost friendly, like a cultural potluck. In reality, it was the largest ecological and demographic reshuffling in human history. Plants moved. Animals moved. Diseases moved. People moved voluntarily and forcibly. Let's float through this gently. Before 1492, The Americas had been largely isolated from Afro-Eurasia for thousands of years. Indigenous civilizations thrived. The Aztec, the Inca, countless others across North and South America. When Europeans arrived, they didn't just bring swords and flags. They brought pathogens, smallpox, measles, influenza, diseases to which indigenous populations had no prior exposure. The demographic collapse that followed was devastating. In many regions, populations declined by staggering percentages within decades. Not because of dramatic battlefield clashes, though those happened, but because of invisible microbes. Migration once again changing everything. Now let's talk about movement in another direction. Europeans began settling in the Americas. At first small numbers. Explorers, soldiers, missionaries, then settlers. Spanish colonists in Mexico and Peru. Portuguese in Brazil. Later English, French, and Dutch colonies in North America and the Caribbean. Land was claimed. Indigenous communities displaced. New societies formed. And labor became the central question. Plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas demanded workers. Which brings us to one of the largest forced migrations in history. The transatlantic slave trade. From the 16th to the 19th century, millions of Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Kidnapped, sold, packed into ships under horrific conditions. Delivered to plantations across the Americas. This was migration stripped of choice. Systematic, brutal, industrial in scale. And it reshaped entire continents. West African societies were destabilized. The Americas' demographics transformed. African cultures blended with European and indigenous influences, forming entirely new identities. Painful, resilient, enduring. The Atlantic became a corridor of constant movement. Ships carrying sugar, tobacco, cotton, enslaved people, manufactured goods. The world economy knit together. Not gently, but permanently. Now let's breathe for a moment. Because migration during this era wasn't only forced. It was also hopeful. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Europeans migrated to the Americas seeking land, religious freedom, opportunity. Puritans to New England. Quakers to Pennsylvania. Scots-Irish to the Appalachian frontier. Later, after independence, the United States would see waves of immigration in the 19th century. Irish fleeing famine, Germans escaping political unrest, Italians seeking economic opportunity. Each wave reshaping the culture. Meanwhile, in Latin America, societies formed from intricate blends of indigenous, European, and African ancestry. Migration creating new hierarchies, new identities, new tensions. Let's drift eastward again. European colonial expansion wasn't limited to the Americas. In the 18th and 19th centuries, empires expanded into Asia and Africa with increasing intensity. British rule in India involved not just administrators and soldiers, but also the movement of Indian laborers across the empire. After slavery was abolished in the British Empire, indentured labor systems emerged. Indian workers were transported to places like the Caribbean, Fiji, South Africa. Chinese laborers migrated across Southeast Asia and to the Americas. Railroads in the United States and Canada were built in part by Chinese workers. Plantations in Southeast Asia employed migrants from China and India. This period saw a new pattern. Global migration on a scale never seen before. Steamships reduced travel time dramatically. What once took months could now take weeks. Railways connected inland regions to ports. Industrialization created labor demand in cities. Urbanization accelerated. People left rural villages for industrial centers. London, New York, Shanghai, Buenos Aires. The 19th century was restless. Millions crossed oceans voluntarily. Millions more were moved under systems of exploitation. The demographic map of the world shifted again. And here's the quiet irony. Many modern national identities were formed during this era of massive movement. Countries now often imagine themselves as historically stable and rooted. But in reality, the 19th century was one long relocation. Entire neighborhoods built by newcomers. Languages blending. Cuisines evolving. Now let's gently approach the 20th century. Because if the 19th century was restless, the 20th century was turbulent. World War I triggered displacement across Europe and the Middle East. Empires collapsed. Borders redrawn. The Ottoman Empire dissolved. New nations formed. Populations were exchanged. The 1923 population exchange between Greece and Turkey forced over 1 million people to relocate based on religious identity. Again, migration as policy. World War II intensified everything. Part 4. Borders, passports, and the very modern idea of staying put. Alright, we've wandered for about 300,000 years now. No big deal. Just a casual stroll across the planet. From barefoot crossings out of Africa, to caravels nudging across the Atlantic, to steamships belching their way into industrial harbors. And now we arrive at something surprisingly new. The idea that movement needs paperwork. For most of human history, if you could physically get somewhere, you were there. There were dangers, of course. Bandits, storms, armies. But there wasn't a laminated document with your face on it determining whether you were allowed to exist in a particular field. Passports, as we know them, are largely a 20th century obsession. Before World War I, international travel in many regions was surprisingly open. You could often board a ship, arrive in another country, and simply begin your new life. No biometric scan. No visa queue. No mildly aggressive customs officer asking about the purpose of your visit. World War I changed that. War tends to make governments nervous. Nervous governments like lists, and documentation, and control. After 1914, states began implementing more standardized passport systems to track who was entering and leaving. Migration, which had been vast and often loosely regulated in the 19th century, became more restricted. In the United States, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had already signaled a shift toward racialized immigration policy. The Immigration Act of 1924 imposed strict quotas based on national origin. Translation. Some migrants were suddenly more welcome than others. Europe, devastated by war, also tightened borders. The era of relatively free Atlantic migration slowed dramatically. And then came the Great Depression. When jobs disappear, tolerance often follows. Migration became politically charged, which, as it turns out, would become a recurring theme. Now let's gently drift into the mid-20th century again. After World War II, the world reorganized itself. Institutions formed, the United Nations, the International Organization for Migration, later the European Union. The 1951 Refugee Convention established legal definitions for refugees. A recognition that displacement, especially after the horrors of war, required international frameworks. Migration was no longer just a fact of life. It was a policy issue, a debate, a headline. And yet, people kept moving. Post-war Europe faced labor shortages. Countries like Germany invited Turkish Gastarbeiter, guest workers, in the 1960s. The assumption was that they would work temporarily and return home. Many didn't. Families formed. Communities established. Cultures blended. France saw migration from North Africa. The UK from South Asia and the Caribbean. These migrations were directly tied to empire. Former colonies sending people to former imperial centers. History circling back in the quietest way. Meanwhile, the United States experienced new waves of immigration after the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act removed earlier quota systems. Migrants from Latin America, Asia, and Africa reshaped the demographic landscape. And through all of this, one subtle tension lingered. Modern nation-states prefer stability, clear identities, defined populations. But humans are not naturally stable. Or mobile. Always have been. Let's float toward the late 20th century. The Cold War created its own migration patterns. People fled communist regimes. Others fled authoritarian governments supported by rival superpowers. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 unleashed another wave of movement. Borders shifted. Economies collapsed. Millions sought opportunity elsewhere. Then globalization accelerated everything. Cheap air travel. Digital communication. Remittances sent instantly across continents. A worker could leave a rural village, find work in Dubai, and send money home within minutes. Entire economies began depending on migrant labor. The Philippines, Mexico, Bangladesh. Countries where remittances form significant portions of national income. Migration became embedded in global systems. Not abnormal, not rare, but essential. And yet, politically, it remained controversial. Because migration forces societies to confront questions about identity. Who belongs? Who decides? What defines a nation? These questions are very modern. If you asked a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer about national identity, they might gesture vaguely at a river and say, "We camp here sometimes." Let's gently address another emerging force. Climate change. Throughout human history, climate has shaped migration. The end of the last ice age opened new lands. Droughts pushed pastoralists into farming regions. The Little Ice Age affected harvests in Europe. But now, climate shifts are accelerating due to human activity. Rising sea levels threaten coastal communities. Desertification expands in some regions. Extreme weather events displace populations. Climate migration is not theoretical. It is already happening. Communities in low-lying Pacific islands are preparing for relocation. Farmers facing prolonged drought move toward cities. Coastal residents shift inland after repeated flooding. It's a quiet pattern, but it's growing. Again, humans responding to environmental change by moving. The oldest solution we know. Now let's pause for a slightly ironic reflection. Modern political rhetoric often frames migration as crisis, as disruption, as something unnatural. But if you zoom out, really zoom out, staying perfectly still for generations is the anomaly. The village that exists unchanged for 1,000 years. Where? The city that never receives newcomers. Almost impossible. Even the most traditional societies are layered with earlier migrations. Languages carry borrowed words. DNA carries ancient crossings. Cuisines blend influences from distant trade routes. The idea of pure, untouched identity is historically fragile. And yet it persists in imagination. Perhaps because movement can be uncomfortable. New languages. New customs. New neighbors. Humans like familiarity. But we also like opportunity. And opportunity often requires movement. Let's float into the digital age. Today, migration doesn't always require physical relocation. Remote work allows economic participation across borders. Diasporas remain connected to home countries through video calls and instant messaging. Identity becomes layered. Someone might be born in one country, raised in another, work remotely for a third, and maintain cultural ties to all of them. Migration is no longer just about geography. It's about networks, fluidity, and sometimes nostalgia. 'Cause moving always involves loss. Leaving behind landscapes, languages, traditions. But it also creates new communities, new stories, new versions of home. Now, as we slowly bring this long journey toward a resting point, not an ending because migration never ends, let's consider something quietly profound. Every human alive today descends from migrants. If you trace your ancestry back far enough, you will find movement. Cross a river, cross a border, cross an ocean, sometimes voluntary, sometimes forced, but movement nonetheless. And the map of human history is not static lines. It's arrows. Soft, overlapping arrows. Some thick with millions of lives. Some thin and personal, but always pointing somewhere new. So when we talk about the history of human migration, we're not talking about a side story. We're talking about the main storyline. The continuous thread from ancient savannas to modern cities. From barefoot wanderers to airport terminals glowing at midnight. And if there's one gentle truth running through it all, it's this. Humans move because we must. 'Cause we hope. 'Cause we adapt. 'Cause sometimes staying means stagnation. And sometimes leaving means survival. So as you settle into stillness tonight, ironically still, remember that your stillness is temporary in the grand scale. History is motion. Your ancestors walked thousands of miles so you could rest here. And somewhere right now someone is beginning their own journey. Quietly. Without fanfare. Just another step in a story that began hundreds of thousands of years ago. When someone, somewhere in Africa, looked toward the horizon and thought, let's see what's over there. Part 5. The quiet patterns beneath all that walking. Alright. We've crossed continents. We've survived empires. We've endured ships, steam engines, and suspiciously bureaucratic border controls. Now let's do something very undramatic. Let's slow down. Because beneath all the specific migrations, the Assyrians relocating entire cities, the Mongols rearranging Eurasia, steamships full of hopeful Europeans, airplanes full of modern professionals, there are patterns. Soft ones. Repetitive ones. The kind you only notice when you zoom out and squint slightly. The first pattern is this. Migration is usually not one big leap. It's a series of small steps. Even when millions move, they rarely move all at once. One family member goes first, finds work, sends money back, cousin follows, then a sibling, then parents. Chain migration isn't new. It's ancient. When early humans left Africa, they didn't all wake up one morning and say, group excursion. Small bands went first. Others followed familiar routes later. Paths become traditions. Traditions become corridors. Corridors become communities. You can see this in medieval trade diasporas. Jewish merchant communities stretching from Spain to the Middle East. Armenian traders linking Persia to Europe. Chinese merchant networks in Southeast Asia. They moved along established lines of trust. 'Cause migration is risky. And risk feels lighter when someone you know has already gone ahead and survived. The second pattern is something a little less romantic. Power shapes movement. Always has. Empires encourage settlement where they want control. Colonial governments draw borders that redirect entire populations. Modern visa systems favor some professions over others. The Roman Empire settled veterans in conquered lands. The Spanish crown regulated who could migrate to the Americas. The British transported convicts to Australia, which, if we're being honest, is a very specific approach to nation building. The Ottoman Empire relocated populations to stabilize frontiers. The Soviet Union moved ethnic groups internally for strategic reasons. Migration is often framed as personal choice. But choice operates within structures. And structures are built by whoever currently has the largest army or the most convincing paperwork. The third pattern is environmental. Humans respond to climate shifts with movement. The Sahara wasn't always desert. During wetter periods, people settled there. When it dried, they moved. The collapse of some ancient societies, like the Maya, involved environmental stress combined with political instability. The Dust Bowl in 1930s America pushed hundreds of thousands westward, not because they suddenly developed wanderlust, but because crops failed and soil blew away. Climate does not negotiate, simply changes, and humans adjust. The fourth pattern is something quietly comforting. Wherever humans go, they bring culture, food, music, stories, rituals. Migration rarely erases identity completely. It reshapes it. Italian immigrants in New York created a version of Italian-American culture that would have puzzled their ancestors in Sicily. Indian communities in East Africa developed distinct identities over generations. The African diaspora in the Americas created entirely new musical forms, jazz, blues, samba, born from displacement and resilience. Migration is not just demographic. It's creative. Painful sometimes, but creative. Now let's float into something slightly philosophical. For most of human history, identity was local. You were from a village, tribe, city. The idea of belonging to a massive nation-state with fixed borders is relatively recent. Mostly a 19th century development. Before that, loyalties were layered and flexible. A merchant in medieval Venice might feel Venetian, Christian, Mediterranean, and part of a particular family network all at once. Modern identity often feels rigid. But historically, it's been fluid. And migration amplifies that fluidity. Forces negotiation. What do we keep? What do we adapt? What do we let go? Now let's gently circle back to something we touched on earlier. The idea that migration is normal. This doesn't mean it's always easy. Far from it. Movement can mean loss, homesickness, cultural dislocation. Ancient letters survive from Roman soldiers stationed far from home complaining about weather and missing familiar food. Medieval pilgrims wrote about the strangeness of foreign lands. 19th century immigrants described loneliness in crowded cities. The emotional landscape of migration hasn't changed much. Hope mixed with anxiety. Excitement mixed with grief. And yet people continue to move. Because the alternative, stagnation in the face of hardship, is often worse. Let's drift toward the present one last time. In today's world, migration debates are loud. Statistics are analyzed. Policies argued over. Borders fortified or open depending on the decade. But beneath all that noise is the same ancient instinct. Survive, adapt, seek opportunity. A software engineer moving from Dhaka to Berlin is part of the same broad story as a Neolithic farmer shifting valleys for better soil. Different scale. Same logic. Now here's a quiet thought to settle in with. If you look at a political map, it seems solid. Clear lines. Distinct colors. But those lines are temporary. Borders shift. Empires rise and fall. New countries appear. And through all of it, people continue crossing. Legally, illegally, voluntarily, forcibly. Maps change. Movement doesn't. Even languages carry migration stories. English, for example, is a patchwork. Germanic roots layered with Norman French, Latin, Norse influences. Every sentence is a small migration. Even your DNA carries echoes of ancient journeys. Genetic studies reveal shared ancestry across continents. Traces of steppe herders. Neolithic farmers, ancient hunter-gatherers. We are walking archives. Now, as we gently close this long, slow drift through human movement, let's imagine something simple. Horizon. Not dramatic, not glowing with destiny. Just a line where land meets sky. Tens of thousands of years ago, someone stood before that line. Maybe they were bored. Maybe the herd moved that way. Maybe the weather changed. And they stepped forward. They didn't know they were beginning a migration that would eventually populate continents. They were just living. And every migration since, from caravans to cargo ships to airport departures, has been a variation on that same quiet step. So when we talk about the history of human migration, we're not really talking about grand events. We're talking about millions of small decisions, tiny movements, accumulated over time. And somehow those tiny movements reshaped the planet. Forests cleared, cities built, languages spread, cultures blended, all because humans are, at their core, restless, curious, adaptable, and slightly allergic to standing still for too long. So tonight, as you remain perfectly still under a blanket, perhaps the most stationary your species has ever been, just remember, your stillness is temporary in the grand scheme. Your story is part of a long, slow procession, one that began in Africa, expanded across the globe, and continues quietly even now. Somewhere someone is packing a bag. Somewhere someone is boarding a bus, a boat, a plane. Somewhere someone is looking at a horizon and thinking, maybe over there. And that thought, soft, ordinary, deeply human, has been carrying us forward for 300,000 years, one gentle step at a time. Part 6. The Myth of Stillness. Alright, we've walked for hundreds of thousands of years. We've crossed land bridges. We've survived empires, paperwork, steamships, and mildly passive-aggressive immigration quotas. Now let's talk about something strange. The myth that anyone has ever truly stayed still. Because when people say, my family has always been from here, what they usually mean is, we stopped moving noticeably about 4 generations ago, which, in evolutionary terms, is approximately 5 minutes. Even places that feel ancient and rooted are layered with migrations so old they've faded into the wallpaper. Take Britain, for example. Feels stable. Castles, rolling hills, polite tea traditions. But look closer. First, there were prehistoric hunter-gatherers crossing from mainland Europe when sea levels were lower. Then Neolithic farmers arrived. Then the Celts. Then the Romans, who stayed for about 4 centuries, built roads, left baths, and then quietly exited. Then the Anglo-Saxons. Then the Vikings, who were very enthusiastic about arriving by boat. Then the Normans in 1066, who showed up, won one important battle, and permanently rearranged the English language. Every wave layered over the last. Modern native identity is often just the latest chapter in a very long series of arrivals. And Britain is not unique. The Indian subcontinent has seen migrations from Indo-Aryan speakers, Central Asian invaders, Persian influences, Turkic dynasties, Mongol-descended Mughals, and European colonizers. China's history includes internal migrations southward during periods of instability, nomadic groups integrating into imperial structures, and waves of settlement that reshaped entire regions. The Americas, as we discussed, were shaped by successive migrations long before Europeans arrived. Paleo-Indians spreading south, later civilizations rising and falling. There is no static baseline, only layers. And yet, humans have a fondness for imagining permanence. Perhaps because permanence feels safe. Migration can feel destabilizing. New languages, new foods, new neighbors who cook unfamiliar spices at slightly concerning hours of the night. But historically, stability has often been an illusion. Let's gently consider cities. Cities are migration machines. They grow by absorbing newcomers. New York was once a Dutch trading post called New Amsterdam. It became English. Then a hub for Irish immigrants. Then Italian, Jewish, Caribbean, Latin American, Asian communities layered in over time. Each wave faced suspicion. Each wave eventually became part of the city's identity. The same pattern repeats in Buenos Aires, Istanbul, Singapore, Nairobi. Urban centers thrive on motion. Stagnation, historically, is not a recipe for prosperity. Now let's float towards something slightly quieter. Internal migration. Not across oceans. Cross regions. In China during the 20th and 21st centuries, hundreds of millions of people moved from rural areas to cities as industrialization accelerated. In the United States, the Great Migration saw millions of African Americans move from the rural South to northern and western cities between 1916 and 1970. In Europe, rural populations shifted toward industrial centers throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. These movements didn't always involve crossing international borders, but they transformed societies just as deeply. Culture shifted. Politics shifted. Music shifted. Migration doesn't need an ocean to be significant. Sometimes it just needs a train ticket. Now let's address something modern and slightly uncomfortable. Technology has made migration both easier and more visible. In the past, migration stories unfolded slowly. News traveled at the speed of ships. Today, images of refugees crossing seas or borders circulate instantly. Movement is no longer distant. It's televised, debated, commented on by people who have never left their hometown but have very strong opinions about those who have. And yet, the underlying motivations remain familiar. Safety, work, family reunification, education. Let's gently reflect on family. One of the strongest drivers of migration is not economics or politics. It's love. Parents move for children. Children move to support aging parents. Families reunite across borders. Entire migration corridors form around kinship networks. This is not new. In medieval Europe, apprentices followed relatives into trade guilds in distant towns. In the 19th century, letters home described opportunities in America, encouraging siblings to follow. The human desire to cluster with loved ones transcends borders. Now let's float back to something we've touched on before. Choice versus force. Migration exists on a spectrum. At one end, voluntary relocation for opportunity. At the other, displacement due to war, persecution, disaster. And in between, a wide gray area. If someone leaves because economic collapse makes survival impossible, is that fully voluntary? If climate change destroys farmland, is moving a choice or necessity? History suggests that the line between voluntary and forced migration is often blurry. People rarely leave comfortable stability for no reason. Movement is usually driven by push and pull factors. Push, conflict, poverty, environmental stress. Pull, safety, opportunity, education, community. These dynamics repeat across centuries. Only the geography changes. Now let's imagine something simple again. A small village centuries ago. One young person leaves for the city. The village elders shake their heads. The youth, they mutter. Centuries later, the pattern repeats. The location changes. The dialogue does not. Migration is often generational. Young adults move more than older ones. Energy seeks opportunity. And eventually, those movers age, settle, and become the elders shaking their heads at the next wave. It's almost poetic, or mildly ironic. Now, as we near the end of this long drift, Let's step back one final time. If an alien anthropologist were observing humanity over 300,000 years, what would they notice? They might say, "These creatures walk a lot." They might also notice that movement correlates with innovation. When cultures meet, ideas cross-pollinate. Paper travels from China westward. Algebra from the Islamic world enters Europe. Crops like potatoes and maize transform diets across continents after 1492. Migration accelerates exchange. Exchange accelerates change. And change defines history. The alien anthropologist might also note that humans argue intensely about migration, while simultaneously being the product of it, which is, in its own quiet way, very human. Now let's bring it back to you. Right now you are still, resting, listening, perhaps in a room built by people whose ancestors came from somewhere else. So as we close this very long, very calm walk through time, let's return to that first image. Horizon. Someone standing before it. Not knowing they were participating in a grand narrative. Just feeling a simple urge. To step forward. That urge has never really left us. Has built cities. Collapsed empires. Blended cultures. Created languages. And carried humanity to every corner of the planet. All from one gentle decision. Let's see what's over there. And in the grand, sleepy scale of history, we're still seeing. Part 7. The future is also packing a bag. Alright. We've reached the present, which, historically speaking, is always a temporary condition. We've walked out of Africa. We've drifted through empires. We've endured ships, steam engines, passports, quotas, and airport security trays that somehow never move fast enough. Now let's do something softly unusual. Let's talk about the future of migration. Not in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way. Just gently. Because if the past 300,000 years have taught us anything, it's that humans will keep moving. The question is not if, it's how and why. And perhaps how fast. Let's start with something already unfolding. Urbanization. For the first time in human history, more than half of the world's population lives in cities. That shift happened quietly over the past century. Rural to urban migration is now one of the dominant forms of movement on Earth. Megacities grow. Villages shrink. Skylines stretch upward while old farmhouses settle into stillness. This isn't new in pattern. We've seen it since the Industrial Revolution, but the scale is different. Hundreds of millions moving within their own countries. Sometimes by train, sometimes by bus, sometimes by foot. Looking for jobs, education, connectivity. Cities offer density. And density offers opportunity. But it also offers crowding, inequality, rising rents, and the occasional existential crisis while staring at traffic. Migration, as always, brings both promise and tension. Now let's float towards something slightly larger. Climate. Throughout history, climate nudged humans around like a very patient shepherd. Now it's becoming more forceful. Sea levels are rising. Extreme heat events are increasing. Water scarcity is intensifying in certain regions. None of this means immediate cinematic mass evacuations. Migration is rarely cinematic. It's incremental. A farmer moves to a nearby town after repeated crop failures. A coastal family relocates inland after the third flood in 5 years. A government quietly begins planning relocation for low-lying communities. Climate migration is not a future possibility. It is already a subtle present reality. And like all migration, it will likely unfold unevenly. Some will have resources to move easily. Others will be trapped, unable to leave even when conditions worsen. Which introduces a new category historians sometimes call Involuntary immobility. The people who want to migrate, but cannot. Because migration requires resources, money, networks, information, the ability to leave. We often focus on those who move. But history is also shaped by those who are unable to. Now let's gently drift toward technology again. Remote work has changed the geography of opportunity. A programmer in Nairobi might work for a company in Berlin. A designer in Manila might collaborate with clients in New York. Economic participation no longer always requires physical relocation. This could reduce certain forms of migration. Or it could encourage new ones. Digital nomads drifting between countries with laptops and very strong opinions about Wi-Fi speed. Technology compresses distance. But it doesn't eliminate the human desire for physical presence. Community still matters. Place still matters. Even in a digital world. Now let's consider something quietly ironic. Despite globalization, many countries are becoming more restrictive about immigration. Stricter border controls. Nationalist rhetoric. Walls, literal and metaphorical. And yet, global inequality remains significant. Conflict persists. Climate shifts continue. The forces that push and pull people do not disappear simply because policies tighten. So migration adapts, finds new routes, legal pathways, irregular pathways, temporary visas, student programs, family reunification. Humans are remarkably persistent when opportunity is on the horizon. Now here's something gently reassuring. Throughout history, societies have absorbed newcomers. Not always gracefully, not always peacefully. But eventually integration happens. Foods merge. Languages borrow. Children grow up bilingual. Suspicion fades into familiarity. It's a slow process, sometimes a generational one. But history suggests that human societies are more adaptable than their headlines imply. Let's zoom out one final time. Imagine Earth from space. No borders visible. No visa lines. Just land and water. From that perspective, migration is simply redistribution. Energy flowing. Populations adjusting. The planet doesn't recognize citizenship. It recognizes ecosystems. And humans, as part of those ecosystems, respond. Sometimes wisely, sometimes clumsily, but always in motion. Now, a final gentle reflection. Migration has shaped not only where we live, but who we are. Our languages are blended. Our cuisines are layered. Our music carries rhythms from distant continents. Our DNA carries footprints of ancient journeys. We are, collectively, a species defined by movement. Not conquest alone. Not invention alone. But motion. And perhaps that's why stories of migration resonate so deeply. Because somewhere inside we recognize it. The urge to leave. The hope of arrival. The fear of the unknown. The quiet courage of stepping forward anyway. So as we close this long, drifting exploration of human migration, from the first small bands leaving Africa to the complex, interconnected world of today, let's end where we began. With a horizon. Someone standing there. Not thinking about history. Not imagining future debates. Just looking outward. And deciding to walk. That single decision has been repeated millions of times. Cross deserts. Cross oceans. Across airport terminals glowing softly at midnight. It built civilizations. Toppled empires. It blended cultures. It carried humanity into every corner of the globe. And it will continue. Long after our current borders fade. Long after new ones are drawn. Because movement is older than nations. Older than kings. Older than language itself. It is the quiet rhythm of being human. So tonight, as you remain perfectly still, perhaps the most stationary your ancestors have ever been. Remember this. Your story began with movement. And somewhere right now someone is beginning theirs. Packing a bag, boarding a bus, crossing a threshold, looking at a horizon, and whispering the oldest line in human history. Let's see what's over there. Part 8. After the horizon. Alright, we've walked a very long way together. From ancient savannas to glowing airport terminals. From barefoot wanderers to biometric passports. From mammoth hunts to online visa applications that crash at the worst possible moment. And yet, we're still not finished. Because the history of human migration doesn't end. Just pauses between footsteps. So let's take one last slow drift. Not toward a specific place but toward a feeling. What does it actually mean that we are a migratory species? Not in the dramatic, heroic sense. But in the ordinary sense. The packing of belongings. Quiet goodbyes. The first night in a new place where the ceiling looks unfamiliar. That moment has happened billions of times in human history. A hunter-gatherer child sleeping in a new valley. A Roman merchant arriving in a foreign port. An enslaved African staring at a coastline that would never again be home. An Irish immigrant stepping onto a dock in New York Harbor. A Syrian family crossing a border at dawn. A student arriving at a foreign university with 2 suitcases and too much optimism. Different centuries. Different circumstances. Same trembling mixture of fear and hope. Migration is deeply human because uncertainty is deeply human. We don't move when everything is perfect. We move when something pulls us, or pushes us, or both. And here's something gently profound. Most migrations are not remembered. History books record the big ones, the so-called Great Migrations, the empire shifts, the refugee crises. But the vast majority of human movement is small and unrecorded. A family relocating to the next town. A worker changing cities. A marriage that carries someone into a different region. These quiet relocations rarely make headlines. But they accumulate. And accumulation is what shapes history. Let's float for a moment into the emotional geography of migration. There's a concept often described in many cultures. Homesickness. The ache of absence. The strange sensation of belonging to 2 places at once. Ancient Greek writers had a word for it. Nostos, the longing to return home. It appears in epic poems. In letters. In songs. It appears again and again because migration always carries that duality. You gain something. You lose something. And over time you become something new. Diaspora communities embody this beautifully and painfully. They maintain traditions from ancestral homelands while adapting to new environments. Food evolves. Language shifts. Identity becomes layered. Children grow up with hyphenated identities. And those hyphens are not weaknesses. They are bridges. Now let's gently consider something unexpected. Even those who never migrate physically are affected by migration. The clothes you wear may be made in another country. The food you eat likely traveled across continents. Tomatoes from the Americas, spices from South Asia, wheat domesticated in the Fertile Crescent. The music you stream carries rhythms born of migration. Jazz emerged from African diaspora experiences in America. Flamenco bears traces of Romani movement across Europe. Hip-hop, born in the Bronx, now pulses in cities worldwide. Migration doesn't just move people. It moves culture. And culture rarely respects borders. Now imagine very quietly, a future historian looking back at our time. They might say, the early 21st century was a period of intense debate about migration. They might note the walls built and the walls dismantled. The refugee camps. The work visas. The digital nomads. the climate relocations. But they might also notice something more subtle. They might observe that despite resistance, despite policy shifts, despite political tension, people kept moving. Because the forces driving migration, inequality, aspiration, survival, curiosity, remained stronger than attempts to freeze society in place. Human beings have tried to stop movement before. Empires imposed travel restrictions. Feudal systems tied peasants to land. Authoritarian regimes controlled exit visas. But eventually movement resumed. It always does. Because stillness is fragile. Motion is resilient. Now let's return one last time to the very beginning. Around 70,000 years ago, small groups left Africa. They did not know they were beginning a species-wide dispersal. They did not know continents would be crossed. They did not know languages would multiply into thousands. They were simply responding to their environment, seeking food, seeking opportunity, seeking survival. In that sense, every migrant today is connected to them. Not symbolically, literally, through unbroken chains of ancestry. Your family tree, if traced back far enough, includes walkers, river crossers, desert crossers, crossers, some voluntary, some forced, all part of the same long current. And perhaps the most soothing thought of all is this. Migration is not chaos. Feels chaotic in the moment. But across deep time it is pattern. It is adaptation. It is how life responds to change. Birds migrate seasonally. Whales traverse oceans. Early humans followed herds. Modern humans follow opportunity. Different scale. Same instinct. So tonight, as the world outside remains busy with flights and ferries and buses and border crossings, you can rest, because this story is ancient. It has unfolded slowly. It will continue slowly. And while policies shift and headlines flare and debates rise and fall, the quiet truth remains. Humans move. They always have. They always will. From savannas to suburbs. From deserts to megacities. From one side of a river to the other. One step. Then another. Then another. And somewhere under a wide sky tens of thousands of years ago, someone made that first small choice. Not heroic. Not dramatic. Just practical. They looked at the horizon. And they walked. And we've been walking ever since. Part 9. Migration as Memory. Alright. We've walked through time. Across continents, oceans, deserts, and cities. Through empires, ports, passports, and Wi-Fi dead zones. And yet, there's one last quiet layer we haven't touched. Memory. Because migration isn't just physical. It's mental. Emotional. Cultural. Every movement leaves traces. Not only in the land or the DNA of those who move, but in stories, songs, recipes, rituals, and even gestures. Think of lullabies sung to children far from home. Recipes adapted when original ingredients were unavailable. Holidays celebrated in new climates. Each adaptation is a record of a journey. A migration remembered in culture. A movement frozen in art. Let's float gently through a few examples. The Jewish diaspora, for instance. Centuries of displacement across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Despite suffering and persecution, communities preserved language, religion, and tradition, often blending them with local culture. Yiddish, Ladino, Judeo-Arabic. Languages formed by migration itself, carrying the memory of multiple homelands in every word. Or the African diaspora in the Americas. Enslaved peoples transported across the Atlantic carried seeds of language, music, belief, and cuisine. Those seeds sprouted in new lands under very difficult conditions. Gumbo, calypso, jazz, samba. Each a living archive of movement. Memory becomes a compass. points back to where people came from, even if they can never return fully. Even small-scale migrations carry memory. A family leaving a village in southern Italy for northern France may bring a tomato sauce recipe, dance, sing. And generations later, the new country tastes, moves, and speaks a little differently, quietly shaped by that old journey. Now this introduces something quietly ironic. History tends to remember rulers, wars, and borders. But the most persistent evidence of migration often survives in ordinary things. In bread. In lullabies. In words. In gestures that feel so natural we forget they came from somewhere else. This is migration as memory. It's subtle. It's quiet. It doesn't appear on a map. And yet it is everywhere. And this memory shapes identity in a gentle, almost invisible way. People carry more than luggage when they move. They carry histories, hopes, practices that will influence the next place they settle. Which brings us to an interesting paradox. Migration is both erasing and preserving. You leave a home. You may lose the landscape, the smells, the sounds. But you preserve knowledge, habits, songs, and stories. And sometimes you create entirely new things from that mixture. Every movement becomes a silent negotiation between loss and creation. Let's gently drift to another form of memory. Genetic memory. Modern genetic studies reveal the paths humans have taken over tens of thousands of years. Mutations, haplogroups, ancestral markers. These are all traces of ancient steps. Some scientists describe them as the ultimate record of migration. Written not on paper but in the body itself. Your DNA may contain remnants of people who crossed deserts 10,000 years ago. Or someone who sailed into a Caribbean port in 1600. Or a laborer relocated by a colonial empire. Each movement leaves a mark. So in a very real sense, all humans are migrants in miniature. Every body is a moving archive. Every mind contains echoes of journeys we will never fully know. Now let's float toward one final reflection. Migration over history has often been portrayed as a problem, challenge, a disruption. But at its core, migration is the engine of human adaptation. Spreads ideas, spreads genes, spreads culture, spreads resilience. Every city that thrives, every cuisine that delights, every language that evolves, all carry the quiet imprint of migration. And perhaps the most soothing thing is this. Even if we never cross an ocean or leave our hometown, we are all connected to this long current. The footprints of our ancestors, their choices, their small steps, are already inside us. We are both the end of old journeys and the beginning of new ones. So tonight, as you rest quietly, consider this. The story of human migration is not only about maps, borders, or policies. It's about continuity, memory, resilience, the quiet courage to step forward, even when the horizon is uncertain. And somewhere, someone right now is stepping again. Perhaps across a street, across a city, across a continent. And that movement is part of the same narrative that began 300,000 years ago. A narrative without a final chapter. Without a pause that lasts forever. Because as long as humans exist, someone will look at a horizon and think, let's see what's over there. And with that gentle thought, our long walk through history reaches, well, a kind of resting point. For now. Because tomorrow people will move again. And the story will continue. Quietly. Relentlessly. Humanly. One step at a time. If you want, I can continue crafting parts 10 through 12 to fully reach the full 1.5 hour, 12,000 word, narration length, keeping the same calm, snark-light sleepless historian style. This would include gently revisiting modern migrations, urbanization, and the subtle humor of human movement across time. Do you want me to continue that way? Part 10. The subtle comedy of borders. Alright. We've walked a very long way. From savannas to cities. From barefoot wanderers to digitally connected nomads. And now, let's pause and consider something quietly amusing. Borders. Humans have a peculiar relationship with them. They seem permanent on maps. They inspire grand speeches. They spark long debates. They generate anxiety at airport terminals. And yet, in practice, they are remarkably flexible. Empires draw them. Empires lose them. Colonial powers redraw them. Sometimes by literally drawing lines on paper while locals watch politely. Sometimes borders follow rivers. Sometimes mountains. Sometimes straight lines through deserts. Sometimes arbitrary latitudes and longitudes that have little to do with human settlement patterns. And humans respond. They move anyway. They cross. They settle. They adapt. Let's gently float through a few historical examples. The India-Pakistan partition in 1947. An arbitrary line drawn on a map. Millions uprooted. Towns split. Families divided. And yet people rebuilt. Found ways to exist on both sides. To cook, trade, marry, and survive despite sudden new borders. Or the Berlin Wall. A concrete division that seemed insurmountable. And yet people tunneled, jumped, bribed, and forged papers. Human mobility finds cracks in the strictest plans. Even today, fences, walls, and visa controls slow movement. They rarely stop it entirely. Which is quietly funny if you think about it. The more rigid we try to make human movement, the more creatively humans respond. History is full of people sidestepping, slipping through, or outright ignoring the rules we set. It's almost as if borders exist to remind us that we will always want to walk. Now let's drift gently into the mundane realities of migration. Not the epic voyages. Not the dramatic refugee crises. But small everyday movements. People moving for work. Families relocating for school. Young adults leaving for better opportunities. People moving because the rent is cheaper somewhere else. These tiny migrations accumulate. They change neighborhoods. They shift demographics. They alter local cultures. And yet they rarely make headlines. Migration is often discussed in extremes. Either mass displacement or heroic exploration. But most of it is quiet, ordinary, low. Which, in a way, is the most human aspect of all. Now gently consider this irony. Humans are restless. We make maps. We build walls. We create paperwork, passports, policies. And then we move anyway. Over centuries, the tools we invent to stay put become catalysts for creative mobility. We find new paths, networks, and strategies. We adapt. The story repeats. Always. Let's drift toward a quieter reflection. Migration is not just physical. It is temporal. Generational. Our parents' choices influence ours. Our grandparents' migrations ripple into our neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces. Even if we stay put, we live in a landscape shaped by movement. Your city, your town, your street, all contain traces of past migrations. Maybe a bakery started by a family that arrived decades ago. Maybe a festival celebrating a culture brought by newcomers. Maybe a building that once housed entirely different people. And we often forget. Until we stop, look, and notice. And that's the quiet power of migration. Changes the world slowly. Layer by layer. Family by family. Step by step. Now, as we gently prepare to continue toward the final sections, one last thought. Migration is funny. Not in a laugh-out-loud way. But in a subtle, ironic way. Humans have spent millennia inventing ways to restrict movement. And yet movement persists. Always. Perhaps it is nature's reminder. You can plan all you want. You can build walls. You can create bureaucracies. You can draw maps. But humans will always keep walking. And that walking, quiet, incremental, persistent, is the heartbeat of our species. If you want, I can continue directly into parts 11 and 12, where we'll slowly bring this narrative to its full 1.5-hour sleep-inducing conclusion, gently reflecting on modern migrations, urbanization, digital nomads, climate shifts, and the enduring pattern of human motion, all in the same snark-light, calm, sleepless historian style. Do you want me to continue?